So my parents used to be big outdoors buffs. My father is an ex-champion hobby boat racer, and my mom was an Alabama-raised country girl, so they always wanted to camp and go sailing and fishing and shit when I was little. They went on a trip with some friends of theirs when I was about 10, Rita's 16 years ago, and since then, they refused to go camping anymore. Ever. My dad told me the story sometime after I had turned 18. It still makes me wonder, considering the following. My parents moved a lot, and only had one set of friends they really kept in touch with at all times. Danny and Lisa. Danny and Lisa weren't outdoors nuts like my parents were, but they were friends, and it was fun to camp with your friends, right? So they all planned a 5-day trip to a lake south of where we lived, with a creek that was on Danny's father's property. So this way, they could camp on the property and fish all they wanted, and then go to the lake with ease. They all left, and everything from now on is from my father's account. He told me this once, and only once, and got drunk after he told me, which is extremely uncharacteristic of him anymore. The first 2 days were normal, just camping, drinking, sharing stories, fishing, boating, and water skiing. It was heaven. They were just young adults and parents having fun. The second night, all they kept hearing were weird yelps and barks. It was like there were 2 dogs in a fight, but they were both just heard and yelping the whole time. They figured it was just coyotes and slept. The next day they continued on their adventures. That night, they kept hearing those noises, but they were extremely close to the camp now, so my father and Danny went out to go see if they could scare them off, while my mom and Lisa stayed behind, scared out of their minds while hiding in a tent, probably reading the Bible or something. Anyways, my dad and Danny went out to look for these fighting coyotes, searching by following the sound. My dad had a shotgun, and Danny had a machete. They were hoping to scare the coyotes, or whatever they were, with a gunshot. They got to a clearing and could hear the noises extremely loud, but it seemed to be from multiple directions. It was as if the sounds were distant from each other. Now, my dad is a bit of a kook, swears he saw Bigfoot at 14, but this is different. He just told Danny to go back. No questions, no explanation, just, Danny, we need to go back. So they did, but the sounds didn't fade away this time. Danny nervously asked my dad what was going on, but my dad wouldn't tell him. He just kept shushing him. Danny is a bit of a goofball, hence why I always like to call him Uncle Danny, so he thought my dad was getting back at him for a prank or something. He kept nudging my dad and trying to get him to say, "Gotcha," but my dad never untensed. Finally, they got close to the creek, a ways up from the camp, and my dad told Danny to run, fast, sprint. Then my dad took off, no remorse. Danny apparently followed, but tripped and called for my dad. But my dad, who tears up and sputters a bit at this part, also uncharacteristic of him, refused to go back for him, even though Danny started to call for help. Danny was yelling at him that his leg was broken, it hurt, and so on, but my dad just kept on running. Then my dad, my mom, and Lisa all say that they heard what sounded like a really fucking loud cougar growl. Imagine 2 lionesses going at it, amplified by 70 Marshall full stacks. That's how loud they said it was. It made my dad's ears ring. After that, Danny stopped screaming for help. My dad got back to camp, and the ladies asked what the fuck was going on, but my dad just said something was out there. My mom, being the practical woman she is, says, well, no shit, but what was it? My dad wouldn't answer. Lisa is freaking out asking where Danny is, but my dad just keeps saying he'll be there in a second. A few hours pass by, and the ladies are extremely worried about Danny, while my dad apparently would cringe whenever they would say something. Finally, from the opposite side from where my dad arrived came Danny, walking just fine right up to the camp wordlessly. My dad cocked his rifle, but waved it away as survival readiness. and that was something that my mom says she won't forget, because that's what tipped her off that something was wrong. Danny walked up and nudges his way next to my mother, but after the weird looks and the death glare from my father, he moved closer to Lisa, who had been nagging him for about 10 minutes, but he would either just grunt yes or no, or would just stare into the fire. My dad finally asked Danny what happened to his leg, and Danny looked up, almost confused. My dad told him, "I thought you said it was broken." Danny looked at him and replied, "Broken." Then, as if on cue, started yelling, "Steve, ow, my leg, I think it's broken." I noped right at that part. I can just imagine it all too fucking well. The ladies grabbed medkits and first aid and water and were rationalizing it as him going into shock. But upon getting his pants off, with much difficulty as he refused to help them and would actually make it harder for them to remove them, there was no obvious break, no blood, just bruises all up and down his side. Lisa kept asking him what had happened, but he would grunt and wave her hands away from the bruises. My dad said, "Oh, he's fine, just let him sleep." My mom gave him the, "Are you fucking kidding me" look, and he gave her the, "I'll do it, woman" look. Yeah, that's right, old school and still working as fuck. And so she complied, as he never does that, and they went to their tent. They say they heard Lisa nagging and one side arguing with Danny because he would never reply when she would ask him questions, which I think is just a genius wife-enraging tactic. And so she finally yelled that she's going to pee. Danny asked if he could come with her since there were animals out there, and not so many words, of course. She said okay, and they left. My dad woke up at about 10ish in the morning and started making breakfast. Danny and Lisa were gone. My mom asked where they were, but my dad wouldn't reply. After a little while, they both came back, rather unceremoniously and without word. They weren't holding hands or in each other's arms, or arm over shoulder or anything like that. They just kind of walked awkwardly, standing next to each other. They refused food, and Danny would randomly yell out, "My leg," and Lisa kept complaining of feeling ill. My mom suggested they go home and call off the trip on account of Danny's leg, who had not been limping at all to my mom's horrified recollection, and the two nodded. My father just kind of watched. They all agreed, so Danny and Lisa got into my parents' car, not theirs, and they just waited. They didn't pack up their tents, food, coolers, bags, nothing. My mom came over and asked if they were going to grab their things, and they just shook their heads. My dad asked, "Why don't you take your car?" And they both just said, "Broken," just like Danny had said last night in a creepy, practiced way. My dad sighed and packed up the car, and they drove off. Danny and Lisa stayed quiet the whole way there, except for random mumblings to each other, completely indecipherable. My parents took them home and came and got me, and we could tell something was wrong, besides coming back days early. They said Danny got hurt, and so they came home. This part is again from my perspective after they all got home. I asked if we could go see them, but my dad replied no, a little too quickly. And so I thought he was mad at me, so I left to go play PlayStation. All I remember is that I missed them and that he was really mean to me, so I snuck back upstairs and listened from the stairwell, and I overheard my parents and grandparents talking about how something wasn't right. It was like those stories, so on and so on. I assumed that they were talking about something random and got bored, and so I went to go play PlayStation again. A few weeks later, I asked about Uncle Danny, and my dad said that we're not going to see them anymore. I was mad, and so I demanded to know why. He told me something about his dad being sick, and so I was sad, and then I forgot about it and life went on. Fast forward about 5 years. I'm at a supermarket where I used to live when this all happened. It was also by where Danny and Lisa lived, only on the other side of the road. Being 10, I was never allowed to go over, but now that I can drive, I decide to go see the old house, check out Danny and Lisa's house. I'm a nostalgic person, and see the old neighborhood. I'm driving slowly and rather creepishly down my old street when I spot Danny walking down the street. Excited as fuck, I flag him down, pull over, and get out to talk to him. He seems stiff to me, kind of robotic, I guess you could say, when he hugged me, but it was way too tight and it felt like he was trying to smother me. I asked him how he'd been, and he said all right. I asked him where Lisa was, and he said at home, so I asked if I could see her, and he agreed. I walked with him and asked him about all kinds of people and tried to catch up, but he didn't seem to remember, or he didn't care about 90% of it. This seemed odd, because Danny was always my awesome involved Uncle Danny. Also, I'm on X, so I'm automatically paranoid and shit. So I asked him a couple obvious trick questions, and he failed miserably. And now I'm a bit nervous. We get to his door and he opens it, and the smell of a goddamn meat locker pours out. A horrid, incomparable smell just assaults my nostrils. The place is a wreck. Shit is just everywhere. Everything is coated in dust and shit, and nothing looks clean. Laundry is everywhere. No lights are really on. It's a mess. I'm more than a little freaked out, and I asked what happened here, and he simply grunted, a really weird, almost guttural grunt. So I asked after Lisa, and she yelled from the kitchen, which was just behind a wall facing the room I was in. It wasn't a full wall with the top not touching the ceiling, so I could smell and hear something cooking. I walked into the kitchen, expecting to see Lisa making some normal food, and planning on asking Lisa why Danny was acting weird. But what I saw was unforgettable. She was standing in the kitchen, butt-ass naked, covered in blood, cooking some kind of mangled mess surrounded by thousands of bones. I was just smart enough to notice a pile of motherfucking collars in the corner too. Though not until I intentionally remembered this at home. They were fucking pet collars. I yelled, and Danny lunged at me. I kind of stepped sideways away from him clumsily and ran out the door. Danny gave chase, and I got to the car and noped the fuck out as fast as my little blazer could go. I got home and called the police, gave them the address, and went straight to my dad. He punched me in the face and told me he overheard the address. I tried to apologize, and he yelled at me, so I just yelled at him for lying to me. So he hit me again, then hugged me and said he was sorry. I tried to ask him, but he, rather strongly, told me to shut the fuck up and forget about it. The police came by my house and told me they didn't find anyone living there, but that my story matched the description and the place was a fucking nightmare. They told me they suspected the previous owners left, and a mixture of wild animals and burglaring homeless people had been living there. My dad, being the fucking ridiculous genius he is, asked why the house hadn't been foreclosed or bill payments hadn't been an issue. The cops stammered, then said that they'd look into it. Apparently Danny's father had still been paying for it all as per some agreement when they got married. I still haven't seen them since, and my dad only told me the story beforehand. My meeting with them was pure coincidence and only made the story worse. A couple of years after all that happened to me, my dad told me this story. He got drunk, and then in his drunken stupor that night, he told me everything that had happened to Danny. He knew what they were. Better him than my dad.